Richard Holloway stepped out of his black car and stood silently in front of the tall gates of his mansion. He had come home one day earlier than planned. His business trip in Geneva ending sooner than expected. His assistant had offered to send a message ahead, but Richard wanted to surprise everyone. Maybe he missed the silence of his home, or maybe he missed the quiet smile of his daughter. Layla, he pressed the gate code. The heavy iron gates opened slowly, and he walked up the marble steps with his suitcase in hand. The house was quiet, too quiet. The guards weren't at their usual spots. Though he knew they were somewhere, watching from cameras, he didn't mind. He liked the feeling of being alone, of coming back to his own space. He walked inside, the thick wooden doors closing behind him with a heavy sound. His expensive shoes clicked softly on the polished floors as he passed the grand hallway. The lights were dim, the walls lined with paintings, but something caught his nose, a smell warm, familiar, almost like a forgotten memory floating in the air. He followed the scent slowly, confused, curious. It was coming from the kitchen. As he got closer, he heard a quiet humming. A soft voice, no music, just someone humming a tune. Richard stopped at the doorway and peeked in. There she was, sitting at the kitchen counter, swinging her feet, her small frame wrapped in a cozy hoodie. Leela, his 10-year-old adopted daughter. She had a plate in front of her, and in her hand, a golden croquette, warm and steaming. She took a bite and smiled to herself, as if the world outside didn't exist. She didn't notice him standing there, frozen in the doorway. It wasn't the fact that she was eating croquettes. It was the smell, the shape, the way the edges were crisp, just right. It was exactly how his mother used to make them when he was a child. His throat tightened, his feet refused to move. It had been more than 20 years since he tasted one. Like that, his mother, God rest her soul, had been a quiet woman with a heart full of warmth. She had passed away long before Richard became a millionaire, long before he had power, fame, and this lonely house. She used to make croquettes on Sunday evenings, always calling them little pockets of love. Only she knew the recipe. She never wrote it down, never taught anyone. Richard had searched years ago for someone who could recreate them, but no one ever could, and now here they were, on a white plate, in the hands of his adopted daughter. He stepped forward slowly, the floor creaking under his weight. Leela looked up suddenly, her eyes wide, her mouth full of food. She blinked, then quickly swallowed, wiping her lips with the back of her hand. "Daddy," she said, surprised. "You're home early." Richard stared at the croquettes, then at her. Where did you get those?" he asked quietly. Layla looked down at her plate, confused by his tone. "I made them," she said. "You don't like the smell." He sat down across from her, still trying to understand. "You made them by yourself," Leela nodded. "I watched videos, and I just tried." Her voice was small, unsure. "I wanted to make something special for you." Richard picked up one of the croquettes, holding it gently like it was made of glass. He took a small bite, and the taste hit him like a wave. Memories poured. In his mother's soft hands, the tiny kitchen in their old house, her laughter echoing as she cooked. His eyes stung, but he smiled through it. "These are perfect," he said, voice shaking. "Exactly like hers." Lila's eyes lit up. "Really? You're not just saying that?" He nodded, unable to speak, just watching her smile. She looked so proud, so happy, and for the first time in a long while, Richard felt something stir in his heart, something warm, something real. They sat there, in silence, father and daughter, both holding onto a moment that felt like magic. Richard had come home expecting silence, expecting routine, but instead, he found a mystery, a connection to his past he thought he had lost forever, all through a single croquette, made by a little girl who had no idea what she had done. He looked at Lila again, at her dark curls and shining eyes. He remembered the first time he saw her at the adoption center, so quiet, so distant, so unsure, and now here she was, humming in his kitchen, cooking with a touch that felt like fate. He didn't know how or why, but something had changed, something big, something deep. He reached out and ruffled her hair gently. "I'm glad I came home early," he whispered. Lila giggled and offered him another croquette. He took it, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel like a millionaire. He felt like a son again, like a father, like someone who had just found a piece of home, and that moment, in the soft light of the kitchen, would stay with him forever. The next morning, Richard woke up with the scent still in his nose and the taste still on his tongue. Even after all his years traveling first class and dining with world leaders, nothing had ever touched him like those croquettes from last night. He sat up in bed, sunlight crawling across the floor, and rubbed his face slowly, trying to understand the feeling deep in his chest. There was a pull, something emotional, something he couldn't put into words. He dressed quickly and headed downstairs, barefoot on the cold tiles, guided once again by the invisible thread of that warm smell still lingering in the air. Layla was already in the kitchen, standing at a little wooden stool, mixing something in a big metal bowl. Her sleeves were rolled up, and flour dusted her cheeks like soft snow. She didn't hear him enter, not at first. Her little voice was humming again, same soft tune from the night before. Richard stood quietly for a moment, watching her, his thoughts full of memories and questions. He finally spoke gently, so he wouldn't startle her. "Good morning, Chef," he said with a smile in his voice. Lila turned, startled, then grinned. "I wanted to try a new version," she said, lifting the bowl proudly. "I'm making croquettes again, but this time with mushrooms and cheese inside." Richard walked over and peered into the bowl, then leaned against the counter, arms crossed loosely. Do you cook a lot?" he asked. Unsure where to begin, she shrugged. "Only when I'm bored, or when I miss someone." That last part made his heart stop for a second. "You miss someone?" he repeated softly. Lila nodded without looking up. "Sometimes I feel like I'm remembering people I never met." Her voice wasn't sad, just thoughtful, like she was stating a fact. Richard didn't respond right away. He watched her hands as they shaped the dough, small and gentle, yet somehow practiced. He couldn't stop staring. There was something about the way she handled the ingredients, like she had done this 100 times before. "You know," he said slowly, "my mother used to make them just like this, almost exactly." Lila looked up. "Really? Did she put cheese too?" "No, she used minced chicken and a special mix of herbs," he replied, then paused. "She never told anyone the recipe, not even me." Lila frowned, curious. "Then how do you know mine taste like hers?" Richard smiled faintly. "Because when I bit into yours, I remembered things I thought I'd forgotten." Lila turned her attention back to her bowl, but her shoulders seemed straighter. Something in her posture changed, like his words meant more than she could say. "I just do what feels right," she said. "I don't always follow the videos." She licked some batter off her finger and added, "Sometimes I see it in my head." "Like flashes," Richard leaned forward. "Flashes of what?" Lila hesitated. "Like a kitchen, but not this one." And a woman's hands, brown like mine, wearing a red apron, mixing something like this. Richard's heart dropped slowly. His mother had a red apron, one she wore every Sunday, a gift from his grandmother. He didn't know what to say. It wasn't possible, yet it was right there in front of him. The daughter he adopted just a year ago was describing images she could never have seen, images from a past that wasn't hers, at least not by blood. He sat down slowly on one of the high kitchen stools, resting his chin in his hand. "I think you'd have liked her," he said softly. "She was kind and quiet, just like you." Layla smiled. "I think I know her already." Her words sent goosebumps down his arms. She placed the tray in the oven, then wiped her hands and joined him at the table. "Do you miss her?" she asked, tilting her head. "Every day," he said, not even trying to hide the emotion in his voice. Lila nodded, then looked around. "Maybe she's still here." Richard followed her gaze around the kitchen. He hadn't changed it much since he moved in. It had all the best appliances and clean designs, But it never felt like home, not until yesterday. Not until Lila brought life into it with nothing but flour, oil, and love. After a pause, he asked quietly, "Would you like to learn more about her?" Lila's face lit up. "Yes, please," Richard smiled, the kind of smile he hadn't used in a long time. He stood up and walked to a cabinet near the hallway, pulling out an old photo album wrapped in fabric. He brought it back to the table, placing it between them. "This," he said, brushing off dust from the corner, "is where it all begins." They opened the book together, page by page. Photos of his mother in her youth, smiling in front of a tiny kitchen, stirring pots. Holding a tray of golden croquettes, Lila leaned closer, eyes wide. "She looks like someone I saw in my dream." Richard didn't reply, just stared at the photo of his mother, frozen in time with her red apron and gentle eyes, and sitting beside him was a child who somehow carried her spirit, her warmth, maybe even her memory. He didn't know how it was possible, but in that moment he didn't care, because something told him this was only the beginning of something much deeper. Rain tapped gently against the tall windows as the house settled into its usual quiet. But inside the dining room, something had changed. Richard sat at the end of the long table, not eating, not reading, just staring into a plate of untouched food. His eyes kept drifting to the small frame of Lila across from him, who was happily chewing on one of her new croquettes. She looked so calm, so at peace, as if the world outside didn't matter. And yet every time she smiled, Richard felt something stir in him, a mix of awe, confusion, and something that felt dangerously close to fear. He took a slow bite of the croquette she offered earlier. It wasn't just good, it was perfect, not in the way that chefs made things perfect, but in the way memories make them feel sacred. One bite brought the old taste back to life, but not only taste. It brought back the sound of his mother's laughter echoing in their small kitchen, the feeling of sitting on the floor as a child, waiting impatiently as she flipped croquettes in an old iron pan, the way her fingers would brush his hair aside while saying, "These are made from love. Richie, not ingredients." He swallowed hard, eyes growing moist without warning. Lila looked up and noticed, but said nothing. She just reached forward and pushed a napkin toward him, gently, like she knew he needed it. And again, just like the day before, he froze, because that's exactly what his mother used to do, pass him a napkin before he even asked. She always seemed to know what he needed before he did. "Do you believe in memory through taste?" he asked suddenly, his voice quiet. Lila tilted her head, thinking, "I think food remembers us, not the other way around." Richard blinked at her, stunned by the strange wisdom in her voice. He didn't know where she learned to speak like that, or how a child could carry such weight in her words, but there it was, floating between them like something holy. Later that evening, when Lila went upstairs to draw in her sketchbook, Richard stood alone in the kitchen. He pulled out one of his mother's old cooking pans, kept hidden at the back of a cupboard he hadn't opened in years. Its handle was worn, the edges darkened by time. He held it in his hands, remembering the last meal she cooked before she passed. Croquettes, again, the final batch. And now here he was, decades later, holding the same pan, while his daughter made them exactly the same way, without ever meeting her. He walked to the living room and opened a dusty drawer full of photo albums. He flipped through them slowly. Page after page, there were pictures of his mother holding a plate of croquettes, her red apron tied tightly, her hair pinned back. One photo made him stop cold. His mother was smiling beside a young woman he didn't recognize. She had dark skin, kind eyes, and looked just a little like Lila. The back of the photo had a name scrawled in fading ink. Amina. My little sister in spirit. Richard didn't remember this name at all. He rushed to his study and pulled out his family tree file. Trying to find a connection, he found a few handwritten notes from his mother, stories she jotted down in a personal notebook. One mentioned a young woman she mentored through a church outreach program, a girl who had lost her family and used to spend Sundays learning how to cook with her. Her name was Amina, and she vanished from the record soon. After no contact, no photos, no updates. Just one line at the bottom of the page. She reminded me of myself as a child. Richard sat back, the weight of the discovery pressing against his chest. He didn't believe in fate, not really, not until now. He closed the book and stared. At the ceiling, could Leila be Amina's daughter or granddaughter? Was this really just coincidence? Or was there something much bigger at play? He looked toward the stairs, where Leila had disappeared just moments ago. Her presence, her instincts, her words, they all felt too precise, too familiar. It was like someone had handed his mother's soul to the universe and whispered, "Give this back to him." The next day, Richard took Leila to the garden. They sat under the willow tree where his mother once planted herbs. The old soil smelled rich and earthy, just like it used to. "Do you want to plant something together?" he asked her. Leila nodded. "Only if we can plant what she used to." "Grow," Richard blinked. "Who?" Leila smiled. "The lady in my dreams." Without waiting for more explanation, she began digging a small hole with her hands, and Richard followed, digging next to her. Both of them planting seeds in silence. As they watered the ground together, Richard knew something had shifted. This wasn't just a bond formed by adoption. This was something older than memory, older than logic. It was a connection written in smells, tastes, and dreams, and somehow, through a child's hands and a mother's croquettes, a lost piece of his life had come back to him. He stood up, brushed dirt from his hands, and looked down at Leila. "Do you think you could teach me to make them the way you do?" he asked. Leila smiled brightly and nodded. "Only if you promise not to cry this time." He laughed for the first time in days. Not the laugh of a rich man or a businessman, but the laugh of a son, a father, and someone who had just found something sacred. The knock came late in the evening, soft and uncertain. Richard was in his study, flipping through old letters when he heard it. Not the front door, but the kitchen door, the one almost nobody used. He stood up slowly, heart thumping in a strange rhythm. Outside, rain whispered against the glass, and the shadows in the hallway stretched longer than usual. He walked through the house, past quiet chandeliers and empty rooms. When he opened the kitchen door, he expected a neighbor or a guard. Maybe someone with the wrong address, but it wasn't a stranger. It was Leila, soaked from the drizzle, holding something close to her chest, a rolled-up piece of paper. Her eyes looked different tonight, not scared, not sad, but searching. Before he could ask, she stepped inside and handed him the paper. "I drew her," she said, her voice calm. "The woman from my dreams." Richard took the drawing with gentle hands, carefully unrolling it on the kitchen table. The page was thick with pencil lines, soft shading, and smudged edges. The face on the paper stopped his breath. It wasn't perfect. It was the sketch of a child, but it was unmistakable. The cheekbones, the hair tied back in a bun, the soft curve of her mouth, the warm eyes. It was his mother. He couldn't speak, not at first. He sank into the kitchen chair, staring down at the drawing like it was a ghost made real. "How did you—" His voice broke. "You've never seen her, Leila." Leila looked at him carefully. "I see her when I sleep," she said. "She tells me not to be afraid." For a long time, they sat in silence, only the sound of rain keeping them company. Richard ran his hand down the page, tracing the lines with disbelief. He remembered telling Leila about his mother just 2 nights ago, but only in words, not in photos, not in detail. There was no way she could know the dimple on her left cheek, the little loop of hair that always escaped from behind her ear. "She stands behind me when I cook," Leila added, barely above a whisper, "like she's showing me how." That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He stood at the foot of his bed, staring out the window, his thoughts spinning in 1,000 directions. His mother had always spoken of souls, of how certain things were passed down that didn't follow blood. "Spirit skips like stones," she used to say, "and it always finds the one who needs it most." At the time, Richard had thought she meant love or kindness, but now he wasn't so sure. The next morning, Richard made a decision he had avoided for years. He drove to the orphanage where he first met Lila, a quiet building tucked between old churches and fading grocery shops. He hadn't returned since the adoption. Inside, everything looked the same hallway, same painting of angels above the staircase, same soft smell of disinfectant and old wooden floors. The director, Ms. Halloran, greeted him kindly, though she looked surprised to see him. "I was hoping you could tell me more about Layla's past," Richard asked, his voice steady but firm. Ms. Halloran folded her hands carefully. "We gave you all the available records. Mr. Holloway, there must be something," he said. "A name, a file, anything." She hesitated, then walked him to a dusty cabinet in the back office. They opened drawers filled with old papers, faded folders, and handwritten notes. Finally, she found Lila's intake form. There wasn't much, just a first name from the birth mother, barely legible. Amina. No last name, no history, no relatives listed. Richard's chest tightened. The name matched the photo in his mother's album, the woman she had once mentored. He stared at the old document like it was a missing puzzle piece. "Amina," he whispered. She was close to my mother." Ms. Halloran looked at him with gentle eyes. "I'm sorry we don't have more, sir." But Richard shook his head slowly. "You've given me enough." On the drive home, Richard's mind swirled with thoughts. Too big to hold. Had fate really wrapped their lives together like this? Had his mother once cared for a young woman who would, years later, become the mother of the girl he would adopt? Had Leela inherited more than just memories? Had she inherited love passed down in silence? He didn't know the answer, but the feeling in his chest told him yes. When he got back home, Lila was waiting on the porch, holding 2 warm croquettes in a napkin. She handed him one, smiling. "Welcome home." He took it, staring at her, as if seeing her for the first time again. He bit into the croquette and closed his eyes. It was her recipe, his mother's, but now it was also Leela's. He sat beside her, quiet, letting the taste carry him to another time. Then he said softly, "Her name was Amina." Leela turned her head, curious. "Who?" "Your mother," he said gently, "and she knew mine." Leela blinked slowly, then looked out toward the garden, where the seeds they planted were beginning to sprout. She didn't speak, but her small hand reached for his. He took it in his own, and together they sat in the stillness. 2 lives, once strangers, now bound by something deeper than names or blood. Not everything needed to be explained. Some things were just meant to be felt. The envelope sat on the edge of Richard's desk like a forgotten whisper. Cream-colored, sealed with red wax, no return address. Just one word on the front, handwritten in careful ink. Legacy. He hadn't noticed it until Lila pointed it out that morning, placing it gently beside his coffee cup. "Mail came," she said. But that one was already inside the gate. Richard didn't open it right away. Something about the envelope made his hands pause. It didn't feel like ordinary mail, not from a bank or a charity or an admirer. It felt personal, old, like it had been waiting for years before deciding it was time to arrive. He stared at it for a long time before breaking the wax and sliding out the folded pages inside. The handwriting struck him first. He knew it instantly, even after all these years. It was his mother's. His breath caught in his throat as he carefully unfolded the letter. She had written it long ago, dated exactly 2 weeks before she passed. It wasn't a will, not a list of assets or instructions. It was a message meant only for him, and somehow it had never reached him until now. "My dear Richie, if you are reading this, it means something has finally come full circle. I've always believed that love survives in strange ways. And if by some miracle you found a child who feels familiar in ways you cannot explain, then you have found your true family. Don't question it too much. Just love her." Richard stopped reading for a moment, his hand covering his mouth. He had never cried easily, not even at her funeral, but now the tears rolled down before he could stop them. Lila peeked in from the hallway, sensing something heavy in the room. She walked in slowly, eyes wide with concern. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. Richard wiped his face, nodded, then held the letter out for her. "It's from your grandmother," he said. Lila blinked, confused. "But I never met her." Richard smiled sadly. "I don't think that matters." They sat together on the couch as he read the letter aloud. It spoke of love, of food, of laughter shared in tiny kitchens, of a young woman named Amina who once came into her life and reminded her of herself, and of a deep feeling, that one day her spirit would find a way back. "I won't be around to see it," she wrote, "but I'll know." When he finished reading, the room was quiet. Lila was staring at her lap, holding the letter with both hands. "She sounds kind," she whispered. "She was more than kind," Richard replied. "She was the reason I believe in good people." Lila didn't speak for a moment, then said, "She said you'd find me." Richard looked at her, confused. "In my dream last night," Lila explained. "She was standing by the stove, and she looked at me and said, 'Tell Richie he found you at just the right time.'" Richard felt his breath catch again. He didn't ask questions anymore. He didn't need proof or logic. Something larger than himself was at work here, something that didn't belong in numbers or business reports. Later that day, he visited the cemetery for the first time in years. He brought 2 croquettes, wrapped in a soft towel, still warm. From Lila's hands, the sky was gray but not angry, the breeze cool and gentle. He knelt by his mother's grave and placed 1 croquette beside the stone. "I understand now," he said softly. "I didn't before, but I do now. She's safe, she's home, and she's more like you than anyone else I've ever known." When he turned around, Lila was standing a few steps behind. He hadn't heard her approach, but she was there, holding the 2nd croquette. Without a word, she handed it to him, then knelt beside the stone and smiled. "Hi, Grandma," she said. "Sorry it took me a while to find you." That night, Richard sat in his study again, the letter placed neatly in a frame on his desk. He opened his computer and began typing, not business, not stocks, not emails. He was writing a book. The title was simple, "Love Skips Like Stones." And the first line read, "I met my mother again, but this time through the hands of my daughter." He looked over at the doorway where Lila stood in her pajamas, hugging a pillow. "Can I sleep here tonight?" she asked. Richard opened his arms without a word, and she ran into them. They sat together in the large leather chair, watching the fire crackle, feeling whole in a way neither had ever felt before. Outside, the rain had stopped, but inside, something beautiful had begun. Not just a family, not just healing, but a legacy continuing in the most unexpected, perfect way. Asterisk. The piano played by itself, or at least that's how it felt. The soft notes drifted from the music room late into the night, echoing through the halls of the Holloway estate. Richard stood outside the open door, frozen in place, watching Lila's small fingers press each ivory key with care. She wasn't reading music, she wasn't trained, yet somehow, her hands moved like they remembered something she didn't. He'd never seen her touch the piano before, never taught her a single note, but now she played the same melody his mother used to hum in the kitchen, the one she claimed came to her in a dream when she was pregnant with him. Richard didn't interrupt, didn't say a word. He simply watched, the music twisting around his heart like vines, pulling memories from places he'd locked away. Every note held a moment, a smile, a scent, a laugh carried on the summer breeze of childhood. When the final key fell silent, Lila turned around, eyes wide with surprise. "I didn't know you were there," she said quietly. "I didn't know you could play," Richard whispered, walking toward her. "I didn't either," she replied, looking down at her hands. "I just knew where to press." He sat beside her on the bench, the old piano creaking under their weight. "It's the same song," he murmured. "My mother played it every week." Lila looked up at him, her voice like a breath. "Did she teach you?" "No," he said. "She said it was meant only for the one who would carry it forward." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Lila asked, "Do you think she's really here?" Richard placed his hand gently on hers. I don't think she ever left. That same night, a storm rolled in over the hills. Thunder shaking the windows and wind pressing against the house. Lila sat curled up beside Richard on the couch, eyes wide with each rumble. He wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and lit the fireplace, the orange glow softening the tension in the room. I don't like storms, she whispered. They make me feel like I'm going to be taken away. Richard's heart clenched at her words. He knew those weren't just the words of a frightened child. They were echoes, carried from places beyond memory. He looked down at her and said, "You're not going anywhere, not ever again," and he meant it, with all the weight of a promise sealed in the heart. Later, when Lila had drifted off to sleep on the couch beside him, Richard sat there awake, staring into the fire. The flame crackled and danced, and for a moment he thought he saw a shadow move across the hearth. It looked like a woman's silhouette, head tilted, hands folded. He didn't feel fear, only peace, like someone was watching over them. He whispered, "Thank you," into the quiet room, not sure who he was speaking to, but certain they heard him. The following morning, Lila surprised him again, this time with something far stranger. She brought him a folded piece of old fabric, pulled from the back of the attic. "I was looking for board games and found this instead," she said, handing it over. Richard unfolded it slowly, his breath catching. It was his mother's red apron, the very one from all those old photographs. He hadn't seen it in decades, hadn't even known it was still in the house. "How did you know it was hers?" he asked, voice low. Lila shrugged. It smelled like her. He didn't ask how she knew what his mother smelled like. He didn't want to ruin the magic of the moment. Instead, he walked into the kitchen, tied the apron around Lila's waist and said, "Let's cook together." That morning, the house filled with smells that hadn't been present in years. Onions sizzling, herbs dancing in oil, dough browning in golden light. They worked side by side, no recipes, no instructions, just hands moving as if guided by something unseen. And when they sat down to eat, Richard knew he was tasting more than food. He was tasting memory, love, and something he didn't have a name for. "I had a dream again," Lila said between bites. "She was standing behind me, smiling." Richard nodded slowly. "Did she say anything?" "She said the kitchen is warm again," Lila whispered. "She said thank you." That evening, Richard walked through the garden alone, the stars bright above him. The flowers he and Lila planted had begun to sprout, small, green shoots reaching up through the soil like they were hungry for life. He stopped by the rosemary bush, one of his mother's favorites, and knelt beside it. "I see her in everything," he said softly. "In her, in the house, in the way things taste again." He touched the soil, fingers sinking slightly into the earth. "I don't know how any of this happened," he said, "but I don't need to." And for the first time in many years, Richard Holloway, a man who once measured everything in contracts and numbers, let himself believe that love really could skip like stones, and that sometimes, through the smallest hands and the simplest dishes, the past finds its way back home. The sound of laughter didn't come from the house. It came from the garden, soft and sudden, like the past had burst into bloom. Richard looked up from his phone and leaned against the balcony rail. There she was, Lila, twirling barefoot, in coat, in coat in the grass, her arms outstretched, her eyes closed. The apron around her waist fluttered in the breeze, his mother's apron, now stained with flour and joy. It wasn't a game, it wasn't pretend. She was dancing with someone he couldn't see, but somehow he could feel it. There was someone there. He didn't call her inside, didn't break the moment. Instead, he watched, letting her spin under the morning sun, as if the air around her had turned warm just for this moment, as if the world had stopped watching and started listening instead. Later, that afternoon, while folding laundry together, Lila asked something unexpected. "Did your mom ever write stories?" Richard paused, holding a soft towel in his hands. "Why do you ask?" Lila shrugged. "Sometimes I hear her voice in my dreams." And she's telling stories not about people, but about feelings that night. Richard climbed into the attic for the first time in years. Dust hung in the air like fog, and old boxes lined the wooden beams. He searched quietly, heart thudding. As memories creaked beneath the floorboards, he opened a faded blue box and gasped softly. Inside were notebooks, dozens of them, filled with handwriting he hadn't seen since he was a boy. He brought them downstairs and placed them in front of Lila, who reached for one with careful hands. The cover was soft leather, worn at the edges, and the title etched in fading ink, "For the Child Who Will Carry My Heart." They flipped through it together, and as the pages turned, Richard began reading. Aloud, each entry was a story, short and simple. A woman baking with a girl who wasn't her daughter but felt like one. A dream of returning as wind in the curtains, or warmth in bread. A note that read, "If love has shape, mine will come back as food." Layla looked up slowly, eyes wide. "She wrote all this before I was even born." Richard nodded. "She must have known something." Leila rested her head on his shoulder and said, "I think she was waiting for me." From that day on, they started reading one story every night, like prayers made from paper and ink, and each time, Leila cooked something new, things that weren't in the notebooks, but somehow felt like they belonged there. Sweet dumplings, corn cakes, spiced teas, food with no names but deep meaning. Word spread slowly in the neighborhood that Richard Holloway, the cold and distant millionaire, had changed. Some said he smiled more. Some said he had music playing in his halls again. But those closest to him knew the truth. His house was no longer a monument to silence. It had become a home. One afternoon, a woman from the local newspaper requested an interview. She had heard about Richard's charity work, but more than that. She'd heard whispers of a girl and her croquettes. Richard wasn't sure, but Leila looked excited, so he agreed. The woman asked her questions with a smile, a notepad in her lap. "What made you start cooking?" Leila answered with surprising calm. "I didn't start," I remembered. "And where did the recipes come from?" Lila pointed toward Richard. "From his mom," the reporter laughed. "But you never met her, right?" Leila just smiled. "Not while awake. The article went viral, not because of fame or scandal, but because people felt something real in it. Grief, hope, memory, healing. They saw in Leila and Richard something missing from their own lives. The idea that love, once lost, could still find a way back through the smallest gestures, through something as simple as a meal. Weeks passed, then months, and their bond only grew deeper. They started a weekend program for local orphans, teaching them how to cook, how to write, how to plant herbs in tiny pots. Lila stood proudly every Saturday in her red apron, guiding younger kids through recipes she couldn't explain, only feel. Richard watched her from the side, often holding back tears as he saw the woman his mother once was, kind, firm, full of light, now living through the hands of a 10-year-old girl. One evening, as they sat together under the stars, Lila asked, "Do you think she's happy now?" Richard looked up, then back at her. "I think she's more than happy." Lila thought for a moment, then said, "I think she chose you twice." Richard smiled. "Once as her son, and again as your father." They clinked cups of warm tea together, their hands touching just briefly. No more words were needed. The wind moved softly through the garden, brushing against the herbs, the leaves, the growing life. It felt like a whisper, a gentle hand on the shoulder, a promise kept across time. And in that quiet space between one breath and the next, Richard knew he hadn't just adopted a child. He had found a missing part of his soul. Asterisk. The invitation wasn't printed, it was handwritten. Just like the letter from long ago, on thick cream paper, with small pressed flowers at the corners. The words said simply, "You're invited to Legacy Night at the Holloway house." No speeches, no cameras, no sponsors, just neighbors, old friends, and children from the orphanage. And at the bottom, in the same looping script, it read, "Food made from memory, not recipes." On the night of the event, Richard stood by the front door in a plain button shirt, wiping his palms nervously. He had hosted fundraisers before, lavish dinners with crystal glasses and long toasts. But this felt different. This wasn't about power or charity or appearances. This was about love, and he wasn't the host, not really. Lila was. She came down the stairs slowly, wearing a soft yellow dress and the red apron tied gently around her waist. Her hair was pulled back just the way Richard's mother used to wear it. He couldn't speak when he saw her, only offered his arm, and she took it proudly. The kitchen was alive with warmth. Steam rose from pots, laughter bounced off the walls, and children with flour-dusted cheeks ran back and forth with spoons and tiny bowls. At the center of it all was Lila, moving like a flame, calm and glowing, showing each child how to hold the dough, how to fold it with kindness. She didn't give measurements, only stories. She told them how a croquette wasn't just food, it was a hug in disguise. Richard watched from a quiet corner as the house filled up with faces. People who once only saw his name on buildings now stood in his living room, holding warm plates and smiling with their eyes. They weren't there for money. They were there because something sacred was being served. At one point in the evening, a little girl tugged on Lila's apron and asked, "Where did you learn all this?" Lila crouched down and answered, "From someone I never met, but always knew." And just like that, the girl nodded like it made perfect sense. Because sometimes, children understand the things adults try too hard to explain. After the last plate was cleared and the fire in the living room glowed softly, Lila climbed up onto a small stool. She tapped her spoon gently against a glass, and the room grew still. "I don't have a big speech," she said, her voice clear but gentle. "I just want to say thank you." She looked around at all the faces, then at Richard. "I didn't know where I belonged before, but now I do." She placed her hand over her heart and added, "And even though my first mom and grandma aren't here, I feel them every day." The crowd didn't clap at first, too moved to make noise. But then someone started, and the room filled with gentle applause, not loud, just enough to feel like a soft embrace. Later that night, after everyone had gone and the dishes were drying by the sink, Lila and Richard sat together in the garden. The rosemary plants were now tall, the little sprouts from months ago strong and full of scent. Lila reached out and plucked a leaf, rubbed it between her fingers. "She used this in the oil," she said, "before cooking the croquettes." Richard nodded. "She said it gave strength." They sat in silence, the stars above them brighter than usual. Then Lila reached into her pocket and pulled out something small. It was a necklace, simple gold, with a tiny spoon charm on it. "I want you to have it," she said. "It's for remembering." Richard took it with trembling fingers. "I'll never forget," he whispered. He fastened the necklace around his neck, the charm resting just over his heart, and for the first time in his life, the weight he had carried for so long felt lighter. That night, as Lila slept peacefully upstairs, Richard walked the house in the quiet. Each room now had a memory, not of loneliness or grief, but of return, of rebirth. He ended his walk in the kitchen, where the smell of fried oil and rosemary still lingered faintly. He placed one last croquette on a small plate, then lit a candle beside it. "To you," he whispered into the stillness, "for finding your way back to me." The flame flickered softly. No voice replied. No ghost appeared. And yet he smiled, because he knew she had never truly left, and neither had he.